The world premiere, first time in Russia. A scientist, a clinical psychiatrist, a neurobiologist, author of the best-selling book The Body Keeps the Score, a researcher who introduced the post-traumatic stress syndrome into the DSM-5 classification by the American Psychiatric Association. Bessel Van der Kolk, for the first time ever, will take your questions at a special press conference organized by Artem Tolokonin's Psychosomatics Institute. Pandemic as the Post-Traumatic Stress Syndrome. A medical doctor graduated from the University of Chicago. A clinical psychiatrist graduated from Harvard. A professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. A professor of psychiatry at Boston University School of Medicine. A lecturer at the London Royal College of Psychiatrists. An honorary member of the American Psychoanalytic Association. A professor at the Chicago University. The author of The Body Keeps the Score. Bessel Van der Kolk.
Trauma is an injury, is a wound. It's something happens to you that is too big for your mind to comprehend. It's overwhelming by definition. It's too much, and so that because of that, the consequence of that is that you get stuck, and things keep coming back, and you get overwhelmed again, and your mind and your brain and your being is incapable of comprehending and making sense out of that event. And because you cannot integrate it, it keeps coming back.
The press conference will be hosted by Artem Tolokonin, a doctor of medicine, a clinical psychiatrist, a sexologist, the founder of Nievita Clinic, and the Institute of Psychosomatics. Hello and welcome, dear friends. Very happy to see you. Having spent years helping patients recover their mental and physical health, I've discovered that the root cause of almost any disease is a mental trauma, and the combination I call the psychosomatic disease scenario. The feeling of being alone and forsaken, mentally and physically violated and unsafe, causes changes in the body that lead to a psychosomatic disease and neuroticism. All of that destroys the quality of life, and I truly believe that the future of healthcare is psychosomatic, where the doctor, the psychiatrist, and a psychologist can join forces to study the case in a holistic way, leading to a much deeper understanding of the nature of a disease. During the COVID pandemic, studying mental traumas has gained particular importance, and it is my pleasure to give you Russia's and world's first ever online conference by a global authority, Bessel Van der Kolk. Please meet our guest. The world premiere, an online conference, Pandemic as the Post-Traumatic Stress Syndrome, by Bessel Van der Kolk. Well, to begin with, I would like to present the book for those who have not yet read it, by Professor Van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. And all those watching us live, by the way, we're talking about several thousand people right now. If you have not yet purchased the book, please do it right now. And I think about 6 months ago, I came across this book in audio mode, and I thoroughly enjoyed the depth of thinking and the ideas that Professor was trying to convey through the book. And I've never felt anything more humane and loving towards the patients, and the kind of thinking and the kind of love towards the patients that is just oozing out of the book. And those watching us live, there is a direct link below, so please use it, tap it, and go and buy that book. So my first question is straight out of that book, which is, let me find it, page 45. And the section is called The Triumph of Pharmacology. Having done a number of studies of different PTSD drugs, Over the years, I've come to the conclusion that they have actually major drawbacks, such as the ability to disguise the actual root cause. And the root cause of the brain disease is being pushed essentially to doctors and insurance companies that take responsibility for fixing the patient instead of the patient. In the past 30 years, psychoactive drugs have become part of our culture with very negative impact. Take antidepressants, for example. If they were really that effective, as they want us to believe, then depression should have never become such a pandemic for the society. Instead, despite the fact that more and more patients are being prescribed antidepressants, the number of cases is on the rise. As a matter of fact, in the past 20 years, the number of patients diagnosed with depression has tripled. Every 10th American is currently on some sort of antidepressant. And then professors basically saying that in 2008 alone, as part of the program, they spent $3.6 billion on all sorts of drug treatment. And in the same chapter, there's a very interesting conclusion that I would like to read for you, and hence my first question. In the brain treatment theory, there are 4 fundamental truths that are being omitted. First of all, our ability to kill each other is similar to our ability to heal each other. And when it comes to the healing process, a lot of that has to do with rebuilding those social connections. Secondly, language helps us change ourselves and the surrounding around us by sharing knowledge. Thirdly, we can actually control our psyche, including the so-called bodily and brain functions, using such things as movement, touching, and breath. So we can change social environment and create the right environment for children and adults so that they can actually feel safe and flourish. So if you ignore the fundamentals of the human entity, you deprive the patient from the ability to self-heal and regain self-control. So patients are not participating in the healing process per se. By outsourcing they've been disconnected. And unfortunately, never gained that self-awareness. Well, in Russia, the use of drugs is on the rise, and depression is very prevalent, unfortunately. So my first question to Professor, I was wondering, is there any improvement out there? Do you see any light in the end of the tunnel? Because we see more and more antidepressants being prescribed. Seems like it's not working. Because, well, you know that the rest of the world is looking at the United States as the beacon of hope. So have you seen any positive trends in the past couple of years? Thank you.
Well, I don't quite agree. I was hoping to see the audience, actually, because I mainly want to see who I'm talking to. I mean, we live in a different country. And so if you can actually show me the audience that I'm talking to, that would make a big difference. Can we do that? I see it well, I don't really. I mainly see myself. I see something very small in the corner. Can you make that screen larger for me so I can see who's listening? Anyway, let me answer your question. It's not that drugs are bad and useless. It's not one thing or another, but basically, we all know that terrible things happen to people all the time. And when you're upset and somebody is there who says, I'll take over for you, I'll take care of this, you don't have to worry, and somebody else is there for you to take care of things, then you're going to be okay. And so trauma is very much an issue having to do with something terrible happens and nobody comes to your rescue, nobody comes to your help, and certainly giving a pill when people are very distressed is not going to help them to be people who are able to find a solution for themselves. Yeah, so we have symptoms, anxiety and anger as warning signs, that we feel in danger, we feel scared. And so the question is, how do we deal with our anxiety? How do we deal with our danger? And that's mainly by being connected with other people who we feel safe with. Of course, both the US and Russia have long histories of people not always being safe with people and having social situations that make things very scary. For example, if you grow up with an alcoholic parent, they beat you up and you're by yourself as a kid and you have nobody who can protect you and take care of you. And that internal sense of being scared becomes part of your biology and part of your physiology. And then the question is, how do we repair that physiology that's stuck on fright, terror, and helplessness?
Thank you very much, Professor. We had a discussion with you a week ago, and you said that, according to your observation, Russia is probably the most traumatized country, and you sort of alluded to that. What was your impression when you found yourself in 1991 in Russia for the first time?
No, I was in Russia in 1991, and I think I was invited to Russia by psychiatrists who were involved in the Gulag. And as the USSR was beginning to disintegrate, these psychiatrists wanted to make connections with what they thought were powerful Americans who could save them from being exposed of having been really working together to lock people up and to use psychiatry for political purposes. And of course, that is not a uniquely Russian problem. That around the world, psychiatry oftentimes is used in order to silence one's opponents, to keep people away from assaulting power. And so psychiatry has a long history of being used for bad political purposes. But I think the Soviet Russia really was particularly good at that. And so what I saw when I was in Russia was an enormous amount of drinking, these days drug taking, and of course, why do people drink all the time? Why do people take drugs? Because they have feelings that they cannot stand. You see this, there's a tremendous correlation between trauma and drug abuse and alcohol abuse, because when you're traumatized and you feel scared and angry and helpless, you have all these sensations in your body that become very hard to live with, and then people take drugs and alcohol in order to make those sensations go away. But the real purpose of the sensations is to help you to move and to change things. And so the body keeps a score, and so the body bears the imprint of that trauma. And in order to deal with that, you need to calm the body down. And so one of the things that I was struck with when I visited Russia is that on quite a few occasions I came across people in parks and people in clearings in the woods who were dancing with each other, who were ballroom dancing. And I thought, oh, that's a nice way where people feel in touch with people feel in tune with other people, and people calm themselves down. So as human beings, our main way in which we calm ourselves down is to be with people who are in sync with us, who see us, who know us, who understand us. We are deeply communal creatures, and as long as we have a deep sense of community and safety in our community, we're going to be okay. But if you are cut off from your loved ones, if people who you care for don't believe you, if you're not allowed to talk about how angry, upset, or scared you are, then you carry that stuff inside, and it causes a cascade of secretion of hormones in your body that then set the stage for developing long-term psychopathology.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. And the next question is about the pandemic. Well, it's been 18 months that COVID has been around the world. And I actually witnessed it firsthand when I was in the United States last year. So me and my wife spent some time there, a couple of months. And then I came back a year later in 2021. And I remember we were flying from Miami International Airport in business lounge, and some people were wearing masks, but most people didn't. It was very crowded. And I remember when I went back to the United States a year after, it was 2021, and Florida is a very liberal state in terms of pandemic restrictions. Everything was open. There were no signs and no feeling that there's any limitation in terms of social distancing or any of that. Yeah, I understand that certain parts of the playgrounds were closed for children, for example, so that children don't mingle together. That's understandable, but everything else was absolutely open. Of course, you had to wear a mask when you go to the mall, but other than that, restaurants are opened, entertainment's open, etc. Everything's open. Then I moved back to Russia in April, and I was blown away. I was very negatively struck by all these big banners and vaccine advertisements. And it's basically saying that, look, either you vaccinate or die. It's a very antisocial in nature. And I believe that this kind of media pressure actually shocks people. And the best example I can give you is a client of mine from Italy. And her doctor persuaded her so much that if you're ill, you should stay at home, you should keep your windows closed, don't go outside, don't talk to anybody. So this poor devil spent basically almost 2 months essentially self-isolating at home, completely alone. And she was ill for a month and then had to spend a couple of more weeks suffering from this condition. So I believe that in this regard, this pandemic had a very major negative impact on her mind and her body. So what about you, Professor? This whole mass media campaign and pressure, does it induce PTSD as such? And if so, I was wondering if with that they actually cause more pandemic cases.
Boy, you make a lot of assumptions there that I wouldn't quite agree with. For one thing, I'm a physician. I know about vaccines a little bit, and I also am old enough to remember polio. And when the polio vaccine came out, nobody said, I'm not going to have my kid be vaccinated against polio, because polio was this horrendous scourge. And so when there's a pandemic going on and there's a vaccine, you take the damn vaccine, and that takes care of business. And so what has happened socially, mainly because of the American previous president, all got politicized, and people started to see the defiance of the medical profession as an act of courage or something. I don't share that. I also live in a part of the United States where everybody is very cautious, where everybody wears masks, and all that nonsense about anti-vaxxing, luckily, is not part of our world over here. But the pandemic in and of itself is not a trauma. A pandemic is an unpleasant experience. You need to be locked up, you need to wear a mask, you need to be careful. That's not traumatic. I call it a pre-traumatic condition. Namely, what do people need to do in order to feel a sense of pleasure, joy, purpose, engagement, is to be with other people. And so the pandemic really made it very hard for people to be in community with others. And that makes it hard because social isolation makes you more prone to feel your depression, to feel your anxiety, to feel your fear more deeply. And so those of us like me who have very good social media, on Zoom all the time, I can go for walks outside. My children who have children, they're locked up as a family, but they spend a lot of time together. And for them, the pandemic has been an inconvenience. The people who have, of course, been most suffering under pandemic are, I would say, most of all, medical personnel, people who have to take care of people The hardest thing actually is to take care of people who refuse to be vaccinated and who get very ill. And then when you deal with people who are ill, who are not vaccinated, you are at risk of getting a secondary infection. And those people go home and they don't dare to go be with their family because they're afraid to infect their family. So for healthcare workers, this has been very, very difficult. The other people who have a hard time are people who work in supermarkets, people who work in restaurants, people who work in nursing homes, who have no choice but to engage with the public. And of course, what is very difficult during COVID is that we can, of course, an old issue in Russia anyway, who can you trust? Who is actually taking care of themselves, or who is going to infect you. So it causes a great deal of distrust if you live in an environment where people actually are anti-science or anti-vaccinations. That makes life much harder. But if you live in a community like ours where everybody takes care of these things, it is not a really major issue. The issue, of course, also during the pandemic, and that is very clearly happening, is that if you live in a household where there is domestic violence, where people beat each other up, if you live in a household where people do a lot of drinking and out of control behavior, then the pandemic makes that much more aggravated. And both in Spain and in France and Italy, some data in the US also, is that during the pandemic, people who have unstable households become more unstable, and there's a sharp increase in domestic violence, in suicide attempts, and things like that.
Thank you very much, Professor. Please, Ivan, get the mic ready, pass it along to the audience, and in the meanwhile, let me ask you one more question. In the past maybe 20, 30 years around the world, and in Russia in particular, we have seen more and more autistic children. And I was wondering if there is a connection between the pandemic and autism in children. So the question to you, Professor, I was wondering, could it be that autism has a direct connection to mental disorders, mental traumas? Have you done any studies in that regard? What's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Well, that's a funny statement coming out of Russia, in that you guys were living under very difficult social conditions before. I don't think you saw an increase in autism under Stalin, for example. I'm not an expert in autism, so I don't want to go there and discuss it. But I would not assume that autism is a major effect of trauma. I not really make that correlation. There's no evidence for that.
Okay, thank you very much. We actually have Julia. Please, Julia, have a mic. Go ahead. Yes, thank you very much. You know that in Russia, we're seeing more and more mass shootings in schools, and we've never had that before. So this kind of mass shootings, I wonder if this is related to the pandemic, and to which extent can we see the kind of impact on teenagers' mind and psychic well-being in this regard? Thank you.
Again, that's a question I cannot answer. I am myself, and in the place where I live, everybody I know is very much in favor of very strict gun control. Actually, I live in the mountains, so my neighbors and I hunt, and hunting is a very good thing if you are into that. But the crazy American thing of making guns legal, that happens in other states in America, is something that I and most of my colleagues are very strongly opposed to. I don't know. I can't say anything about the social increase in mass shootings. I'm not even sure if that's true necessarily. I'd need to see the data. Russia had a long history of nihilistic anarchists attacking, bombing people before the revolution. That probably has a little to do with social unrest and people feeling very helpless. I don't know if there's an increase in school shootings in Russia right now. It's not really what we focus on. I really focus more on what happens in families, what happens in schools, what happens in people's ordinary lives. And that's really where most trauma takes place, is within families and neighborhoods.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. We actually have a professor here in the room, PhD, of course. Please, madam, you have the floor. Absolutely. Where are you? Oh, yeah, right there, right there. Yeah, go ahead. Hello, Professor. Thank you for having me. I'm a psychiatrist by nature and by background. So my question to you, Professor, is the following. What kind of mental deviations are you observing at the moment, in particular during the pandemic, in terms of frequency, and maybe during the post-pandemic time? I was just wondering, in terms of your colleagues, what are they seeing? What kind of clinical representations are the most common in terms of patients that are coming to you for help? Thank you.
I can't say much about it. I follow the developments very closely. I'm a part of a group of physicians here who track the impact of COVID. And at this point, I don't think we know what mental disorders actually are increasing. I think social isolation increases whatever mental disorder you have. So if you have a tendency to become depressed, you become very isolated, there's more depression. There's more. The main thing that we see actually around the world right now is an increase in violence. And why this is really very interesting to me is there is something about people moving together, like the Moscow subway or walking in the streets of Moscow, that allows people to sort of synchronize their bodies with other bodies, and that seems to be giving us a sense of pleasure in control, is to move rhythmically with other human beings. And I think that sense of moving together with others gets undermined by the pandemic. People are more isolated, and I think that may give rise to an increased disinhibition. But it's premature to really say anything scientific about that.
Well, let me ask you one more question, and then I'll pass the floor to the students. So, this is a very important question about the PTSD and the time effect. And let me read out this question. It's a historical reference, as a matter of fact, to frame my question in a better way. There was an incredible psychiatrist in the United States, Josephina Hilder, and she was a clinical professor at the Stanford Medical School. And back in the day, she did a study of mental health, and she developed this reaction to anniversary effect. That was 1953, basically saying that certain lapses can happen during an anniversary of an important milestone event in the life of a patient. For example, when someone important for you dies, like a mom or a dad, for example, when you reach as a patient the same age. And this is actually the official title, of course. That's another incredible psychologist, Anne Anselin Schusselberg, and in her book, the ancestor syndrome. She basically referencing her study and saying that, well, Josephina was using the idea of anniversary to describe specific cases, such as the age of losing a parent, etc. But this is actually a much wider impact because, as she quotes, she has seen it in terms of deaths, miscarriages, etc. 5, 8, and more generations. That's all the way down to 200 years down the ancestry tree. So, and American historians say that the second and the third presidents of the United States, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, actually died on the same day, which is July 4th, 1826. And that's the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which happened July 4th, 1776. Seems like they were waiting for this date to participate in this anniversary and then to pass away. So my question is there such an effect, such as PTSD, basically showing itself through time? Do you see any parallels?
Well, the issue of anniversary phenomena is interesting. I don't know if anybody has studied it scientifically, but certainly in a book I wrote 25 years ago, I have a number of very, very, very flagrant histories of people who, on the exact anniversary of a major disaster, replayed it, reenacted. So there is something in our brain that's a timekeeper. I don't think we understand at this point what a timekeeper is like and how the brain gets to have a calendar, but the brain certainly does. And oftentimes people do have major upheavals on exactly the dates of previous traumas, but it's just something that we see over and over again. But I don't think we know the precise psychophysiology of those anniversary reactions. But certainly as a clinician, and people suddenly become upset about something or do something out of the ordinary, it might be useful to actually say, so what does this time of the year remind you of? Or what happened this time of the year in your life? And people may say, oh, it's the time that my father was killed or that I was raped or something. These things do happen. It's a phenomenon.
Thank you very much, Professor. And the next question goes to one of our students, by the way. Yana, please take it away. Hello, Professor. So my question to you is, other than isolation, during the pandemic, I see that a lot of people that are, 40 plus years old, develop this fear of death because there's so much information in the media. They always, give you numbers in terms of, hospitals overflowing with patients. They always give you numbers of how many people died. So they're afraid to actually go outside. They are afraid to walk in fresh air. So what should these people do? Is there any way for these people to self-heal? Can they find any way out of it? Or do you need a psychiatrist or psychotherapist to help them out? If there is a form of self-healing, what would you recommend? From a mental standpoint, how can they help themselves?
I don't quite understand the word, use brainwashing here. Well, you should be careful to go out in the street. I don't quite know what to do with this question either. I'm of a certain age. A lot of people my age are ill, are dying, have operations, and COVID makes it hard to be ill. Not so much for the fact that you're going to die, because we're going to die. That's part of our fate for all of us. But what has made it hard in this past year, certainly in the environment that I live in, is that people find great comfort being with other people as they're sick. And COVID really has kept people from being with other human beings. Let me give you an example of that. I lived in Hawaii for quite a long time and did part of my medical training in Hawaii. And I was always very struck how different ethnic groups dealt with death. The Hawaiians always gathered their family around them, and the kids would dance the hula, they would play the guitar together. And so death for all the Hawaiians was always a very communal issue. Even the Japanese population, the Chinese population, also families were very close to people who were dying, and they took care of each other. That was an ethnic issue. Caucasian people in Hawaii tended to be very alone and die by themselves. And so what I really learned at this point is the enormous comfort that people get when they're scared, when they're dying, of having their children and grandchildren and their friends around them. And that was the piece that was really missing during the pandemic, in that people died by themselves. And that was also extremely hard for medical staff, because again, I know this from experience, that when you work in a hospital, how you deal with dying people, but you leave it up to people's families to be there for comfort and sustenance. What happened during the pandemic in the world that I live in is that the family was not allowed to come and visit. So people were by themselves. And that made the whole process of dying much more difficult. It made it much harder for the nurses and for the physicians, because they felt they needed to step in and be much more of a human being with their patients, and not just a technical physician, than they would have otherwise have been, because the family disappeared and people were by themselves. And that loss of social connection as people were dying was extraordinarily difficult.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Professor, this is my personal question to you. When people learn about your age, they're just blown away. Well, in Russia, we don't actually ask directly, how old are you? But let me just say that you were born 47 years prior to me getting married. And that was July 8th. And in Russia, this is the day of family and fraternity, which is very symbolic, by the way. So I have a very simple question to you. What's your secret to longevity? Because you look so young. Yoga, Pilates, special dieting, some hormonal injections. I'm just wondering, because in Russia, some people drink the blood of young calves to stay lively and young. So what's your secret?
I don't think I look exceptionally young. I think most of my friends look about the same as I do. Having a good life and a productive life, and moving your body, and I ride my bike every day, and I do yoga oftentimes, and being in a loving relationship, of course, helps a lot too. But I can't say that I have a secret. I know that I am going to die just like everybody else, and it's just a question of time. So far, I've been lucky. Yeah.
Okay, please pass the mic. Introduce yourself.
Nice to see your audience and how well dressed everybody is. Actually. A very elegant group of people.
Thank you so much, Professor. So my question, and my name is Evgenia, and this is a follow-up to the previous question. So I practice intermittent fasting. I believe that it's an incredible tool to self-healing. I've been doing this for 12 years now. So what's your take on fasting or intermittent fasting? And do you believe that this as a tool can actually be used to treat mental disorders? Thank you.
You know, it's interesting. That's why it's so nice to go to other places to learn what people in other places do. Intermittent fasting is not a very widespread thing over here. I certainly don't know anything about it. So rather than a question, maybe you would like to tell everybody how useful it is, because I wouldn't know that. That's not something that's part of my world. But it's nice to hear that it works for you.
And the next question is from one of our students. Go ahead. Absolutely. Raise your hand. Yeah, right there. Hello, dear professor. The question is, well, there have been so many questions about COVID, but still, the situation in Russia is a bit different in the sense that there's a different attitude to COVID. We almost treat it as if it's war. It's like civil war. It's like going to civil war. I know that you've studied, patients that came from Vietnam War. I mean, people that have survived real war, Afghanistan war, etc., etc. Can you equate the COVID-induced mental trauma to the actual shell-shocked and the PTSD that is a result of real war? Is it similar or is it different? And should the approach in terms of treatment be similar or different? I'm just wondering about that. Thank you.
Well, as I said before, I don't see COVID as really a real antecedent of PTSD. I think COVID is inconvenience, and if you're already traumatized, it's much harder to be social isolated, etc. But trauma is about horror. It's about being absolutely stunned by something horrendous. And that's not what COVID is for us, except maybe for that nurse who works in a nursing home. She sees somebody who she cares for die and choke. That's maybe traumatic. Or if you see your own parents or your own child die of COVID, that may be a very terrifying experience. But trauma is really, by definition, a trauma. It's something that's horrendous, that is not gradual or minor. It's like, oh my God. Huh? And at the moment of that horror, all kinds of things happen in your brain that I talk about in my book, that certain parts of your brain go offline and no longer function. And because of that, you get stuck in an emotional state of fear, terror, and rage. But it's because at that moment, your mind and your brain and your body is not able to deal with whatever is going on. And so COVID, you should not put it in the category of trauma, except for there may be traumatic incidents for some people in the middle of the COVID.
And let me ask you a couple of questions from my subscribers. The first question, which is very, very painful, seems to be for one of these subscribers. Professor, what is the relationship between the trauma and your level of income and the ability to do business?
That's a very interesting question, actually. There was an interesting study that I quote in my book of the Harvard classes of 1939 to 1942. So Harvard is one of the great prominent universities in the world, and people who go there are privileged people. And they're people who already have proven to be quite smart. Then these guys went off to war, and it turns out that these people who already had a very good education, who were very smart, actually became more successful than other people. Their interpersonal relationships were terrible. They may have become drunkards, or they may have suffered from depression, but they found refuge in their work. And so workaholism, excessive working and completely focusing on your work is a very common adaptation to trauma among people who already have talent and who already have some privilege. If you are young and you get traumatized by alcoholic parents and family violence and sexual molestation, it doesn't mean that you will not be successful, because some people, again, are able to dissociate the misery that comes from the early abuse and neglect and focus on a particular area of competence. But overall, childhood trauma really interferes with your capacity to learn, because your brain gets rewired to always be on alert for danger, and your brain gets wired in a way that it's very hard to filter out what's important from what's unimportant. And in order to learn, you need to be able to focus. And early childhood trauma has a tremendously negative effect on being able to focus. And in order to make money and to be successful, you actually need to be able to concentrate and to focus. And certainly early childhood trauma severely interferes with that. But adult trauma oftentimes leads to people becoming hyper-focused in their work, but interpersonal relationships almost always suffer very badly.
Here's another interesting question from my subscribers. The fact that you've forgotten certain episodes from your past, is it an indication of PTSD? I mean, the fact that you don't remember certain things about your past, is it indicative of PTSD, do you think?
Good question. By and large, if somebody doesn't remember their childhood, there's either something neurologically very wrong with them, or they have blocked it out and dissociate of their trauma. And of course, blocking out your trauma is a very common thing. That is, the mind gets overwhelmed with the memory. And so those of you, for example, who work in emergency rooms, if you see people come in right after having been raped, after having been assaulted, having been in a terrible accident, but you oftentimes see that people don't have much of a coherent story about what happened, because all they have is sensations of terror, fear, and rage, but there is no clear narrative, because the narrative part of your brain gets shut down when you become really upset, and it goes into the survival part of your brain that makes your body react in certain ways. And it's actually pretty standard for people who have been terribly traumatized to miss large chunks of the experience, to not remember a lot of pieces, but oftentimes to have one little detail, a fragmented memory, like the smell of your rapist, or your body sensation while you were beaten up, or an image of, let's say, for example, I was mugged at some point in the middle of the night, not far from my home, many years ago. And what I remember is lying in the snow. I have sort of a picture in my mind of lying in the snow, and otherwise I remember very little. And that's sort of common how it is when something terrible happens to you. You remember a small detail, but not the whole story. Let me say one more thing about it. So when you don't have a memory, Sigmund Freud said it very correctly. He said, if you don't remember, you act it out and you behave as if you're still being traumatized. So you may not remember being beaten up by your father, let's say, growing up, but when somebody is difficult with you, you may go into a rage reaction, as you and have the same emotional reaction as you had when your father would beat you up or put you down. And so you may have an intense sensation, but you won't know that it's a memory, it's a reliving of the past. So a very critical part of trauma is that you don't remember it, but you relive it. You go there again and you feel what happened in your feelings and your sensations, but oftentimes not so much in terms of words and narratives.
Question from Julia. Have you done any studies about children that had a prenatal stress? Let's say, I lost my husband when I was pregnant. I have a son. He is in adolescence and he has a difficult life. So I was wondering if I can somehow eliminate that past trauma. Does it affect the brain and future development? And if so, in what way?
It's a good question. There's some research done by a Dr. Öhman in Stockholm, in Sweden, that actually looked at that. I myself have not looked at that because I have seen so many people to whom terrible things happened after they were born, so they have had no personal inclination to go even before that time. But there is a fairly, if you want to take that seriously, I would. The way I look up any questions I have is I go into Google Scholar, which I'm sure you can access in Russia also, and I type in my questions. I might type in trauma and prenatal factors. And when you type on Google Scholar, all the articles about trauma and prenatal factors will come up, and you'll be able to retrieve that literature. But for me, I see so many abused and neglected children that I don't need to go prenatally to find out what happened to them.
Thank you very much for that. We actually have an assistant from the Polina Georgievna right here. Polina Georgievna. She's the PhD from the Psychosomatic faculty. Go ahead. So my question to you is as follows. You say that the COVID pandemic is not a trauma for most people, but is it trauma for medical workers that are directly involved with the COVID, that work with the patients as well as the aftermath of COVID, such as psychiatrists that work with the post-COVID syndrome? Can you call this a mental trauma? And if so, what should we do about it? Thank you.
I would need to hear more about what sort of people you work with and what the problems are of the people you work with. Of course, being a psychiatrist and being a physician in general, you always deal with very hurt people and very scared people. So I'm not sure whether dealing with very scared people because of COVID is in any way different from people who are very scared because they have a violent roommate or after they have been assaulted in the street. All these things are part of what we do every day. And I think our biggest challenge is how do we calm ourselves down and how do we calm the people who we work with down. And that is something that I think we don't learn very much in medical school, neither in the US nor in Russia. And learning to calm yourself down by the way you breathe, calming yourself down by getting body work and massages, calming yourself down by engaging your body in focused activity like martial arts or tango dancing is a very good way of calming that body down and staying focused. And so I think the great challenge for us as healthcare providers is that how do we calm ourselves down? And that is not primarily for alcohol, although that seems to be the primary way that people in both Russia and the US try to do that. But you need to really learn to take care of your body. And in that regard, I learned a lot about it in my travels in China and in Africa. In China, even during the very dark days of China, a lot of people were doing Qigong and Tai Chi, making these body movements. And even today, I was back in China last year again. I've been there a number of times. I'm really amazed with how many people do these communal body activities that seem to have a very quieting effect on the body and on the mind. Similarly, when I have gone to Africa and India also, you see that people drum together, make music together, sing together, engage in rhythmical activities, and that helps the whole community to make themselves calm down. Interestingly, at my own hospital, the Boston Medical Center, when COVID started, our medical personnel also started to do collective dance classes. I thought, boy, they've got it. That's the right thing to do. So the big challenge for us, dealing with all that misery that we deal with, is how do we calm ourselves down? How do we make ourselves feel safe? And I think touch, rhythms, and movement are a very important part of that.
Excellent. Dancing, I love it. We should do more of it for sure. So the next question is from Yelena. Yelena, please take a mic. Go ahead. Hello. Based on what I've heard, seems like we have a different course of pandemic. Well, in Moscow, there's a lot of children that had to study remotely, study online, and the children had to stay in lockdown, basically, in small apartments. Well, not everybody has their own house, of course. In Russia, most people live in apartment blocks. So basically, children had to get stuck in four walls, essentially. And you see that children got really depressed. For more than 6 months, you have to stay at home, and that's very depressing. And you don't, play with other children and all that. So there's a lack of real human touch, and because of that, children got really depressed. That is not necessarily a traumatic situation per se, but what would your recommendation be in terms of what you would do about it if there was another wave of pandemic and another lockdown?
Yeah, it's a very important question. It's not a question about trauma. It's a question about human development, and a very important part of growing up is playing, and more than learning academic stuff, which we keep focusing on. The important thing you learn to play in school is you play with other people. You pass things back and forth. You learn to collaborate. You learn that your input is important. You learn how to have friends. You learn how to collaborate, to be in tune with people. And of course, all of that has taken quite a severe hit on our kids. And I'm actually gravely concerned about it, that we'll go right to the mental processes, but that our kids may, that's something certainly to pay attention to, they may actually have deficits in being able to collaborate, engage, and work together with other human beings. For me, the whole issue of trauma in that regard is very relevant. And that is, when you're traumatized, it usually is a function of somebody who does something terrible to you, and no matter how you scream or yell or what you try to do, that person doesn't listen for you. So trauma is the ultimate sense of disconnection. And when somebody beats you or rapes you, you feel like, oh my God, nobody is coming to my help, nobody is helping me. And it leads to a very deep sense of physical isolation. I think a very important part of healing from trauma is to get intense interpersonal relationships. One of the things that I write about in my book, and something that I'm still very active in where I live, is to do theater with kids, where kids get to really collaborate, to take on a role, to make things together, to do things together. And if I were in any sort of social program post-COVID, I would focus intensely on rhythmical, collaborative activities between people where they can explore how people can do things together and collaborate with each other. Part of the reason why I don't like to be on screens, and certainly not on screen with Moscow, is that if I were there for a few days, we would have done things together. And we would have gotten out of our chair, and from what I can see of your audience, you're a very lively group of people, and we might have done some moving together, some dancing together, some exercises to be in tune with each other, to illustrate how critical it is to overcome trauma. You need to be back in tune and in touch with other people. And in tune means moving, and in touch means to be touched. And I have no idea what your Russian cultural take is on touching, but for me and my patients, it's terribly important that people go do body work, get massages, go to the hammam, feel the pleasure of other people's bodies next to their bodies. That's part of the pleasure and the comfort of life, is to be in touch with other bodies through touch and movement.
Absolutely, Professor. We'll have you in Moscow the moment the lockdown is lifted, and hopefully, of course, there'll be more connections between Russia and the United States, for sure. So we're looking forward to meeting you in person, because we, live and breathe one air, it's one planet. Of course, we want mutual trust and respect. Everybody want to be happy, right? So hopefully, we'll, of course, see each other, in touch. Personally, of course, after the COVID, hopefully the political situation will get better. So I will definitely, will be looking forward to having you here in Moscow. So the next question to you is, can you share your experience of organizing comprehensive trauma treatment and trauma support? So, and talk about your own center. How was it developed and how is it organized?
That my center, I built it up for 40 years and then it fell apart at the end. Is that what you want to hear about? Or you want to hear about how to set up a trauma center?
Yeah, the whole approach. How do you organize a system from your standpoint? The A, B, C, D of it. How do you treat such traumas in the best way possible? How should the center be organized?
Great. It's a great question. I love to tell you about it. So first of all, you got a group of people together who share an interest, and you have regular meetings where you talk about your cases, and you present them, and you learn from each other, and ideally, and something very central to the work that I've always done, is to make videotapes, and you show videotapes of your work with your patients to each other, and you sort of think about what happened here, what was useful, what wasn't useful. But most of all, it's very important to be able to talk about what we see. That we hear terrible stories all the time about rape and incest and child abuse. So it's very hard to take. So it's very important to have a group of colleagues with whom you can talk about all the stuff that you see, and hopefully have some fun together also, but have collegiality and collaboration. This work cannot be done by yourself. It is too painful to do it all by yourself. The second thing is you learn things together. For example, at the Trauma Center, we always have trainings in various techniques. So as a group, for example, you may learn EMDR. To my mind, I don't understand how you can be a trauma therapist and not do EMDR because it's such a spectacularly effective treatment. And then you all get trained in some form of working with the body. So you learn about somatic experiencing, or you learn about sensory motor psychotherapy, but something about really tracking people's physiology and working with bodily arousal. And the next thing you may want to do as a group is to learn neurofeedback. One of the world's greatest neurofeedback experts lives right in St. Petersburg. Yuri Kopitov is a genius when it comes to the brain and neurofeedback. He's one of my consultants for many of us. And so you learn neurofeedback, and as a group you learn how you can calm the brain down by playing computer games with your own brain. And you do this as a group. You learn one thing, you learn another thing, and then at some point you may say, we need more of a body component, as we did at the trauma center. So we start yoga classes. And we did yoga classes for the staff, and all of us would meet every Wednesday morning and do yoga together. The hospital I'm involved with now, same thing. People have regular yoga sessions, and you learn what it's like to communally experience calming your body down. And then when time is ripe, you can do the next step, which you guys aren't ready for yet, is I have a team that does psychedelic therapy. And so you explore as a group what that is like, for whom it works, you learn from your mistakes, and you share your impressions with each other. But you learn together as a group. The Trauma Center and the Trauma Research Foundation for me has always been a place of ongoing learning. And there is no end to your learning. Every time you learn something new, you think, I know a little bit more now. And then you learn something else that's different. And so, to my mind, this is a lifelong learning process. If you want to see what we do, you may want to go on our website, the Trauma Research Foundation, that sort of spells out a lot of the different activities that we promote and that we learn from.
Thank you. Please pass the mic. Introduce yourself.
Let's do 2 more questions.
Hello, my name is Alessi Saenko. I'm a professor. So, I feel like there's so much anxiety about the COVID situation. And I know that many parents, they actually take their kids away from hospitals, from schools, because they're afraid of vaccinating their children. I know that a lot of people in Russia don't want their children to be vaccinated, and there's a lot of pressure in this regard, and it feels like your freedoms are being violated in this regard. It's almost like you're out of breath. So, and this leads to depression. So, children and adults, how do we live in this world where our freedoms are being limited? And it's almost like we're out of breath. We're choking on lack of social contact, especially for children, because children need to be together, develop their social skills, improve their emotional intelligence. It seems like we don't have that because of the COVID limitations. So what are the options in this kind of situation? What should we do? Maybe you have a solution. Thank you.
Well, you're asking the question just at the right moment. The Trauma Research Foundation actually is having a special day on play, and I urge you to sign up for that. It's going to be 2 weeks from now, and 3 of the best play people in the world are going to be presenting to all of us. So, Trauma Research Foundation. You asked me 2 questions. One is whether or not to take vaccines. I don't know how it plays itself out in Russia. In America, it's purely a function whether you think that Donald Trump was one of the craziest people who ever lived, or whether you think he's a great hero. I happen to think he was a horrible human being, and he politicized all of this stuff, And any scientist I know, any doctor I know, we do vaccines. That is the right thing to do. But it got all politicized, and it sounds like it gets politicized in Russia as well. And it's just a crazy phenomenon that you vaccinate. But politically, that's become a controversial issue. The second thing, playing together is of course critical. And actually, I've been impressed with the people I know, how much time they spend with their children, how much they go on bicycle rides with their kids, they move their kids, they dance with their kids. It's a question of consciousness. That if you're a conscious person and you're not too depressed and you don't drink too much vodka, you think, let's play with our kids, let's move, let's throw let's throw a ball around, let's play hide and seek. So it's kindergarten teachers, same thing. You move together, you play together, you work together, and that is really what we do. We even play on screens, and we play games together on screens, and you move and you interact, and that is really what makes people feel alive and gives them a sense of pleasure and safety. And actually, I've been impressed with the people who I know who are raising kids. I know quite a lot of them. Have done actually been very creative and very good in keeping that liveliness going. Of course, as a family, you have to make a decision about how much screen time there is. Again, the young parents who I know are very strict about screens. Maybe 20 minutes of screen time per day, and the rest of the time we do things and we make things. I'm very worried about screens and people focusing in an immobilized way on a pseudo interaction rather than a real interaction. And I think, for example, I'm also opposed to telemedicine, doing therapy only on screens. I think people need to be together, they need to interact with each other. Okay, last question.
And one last question from myself. So, what's your next step? Because we have the book, The Body Keeps the Score. Please read the book, everybody. But what's your next step? What are you working on right now? What is the focus of your scientific interest right now?
Well, right now, I have two major projects, or three basically. One is that I am training people in neurofeedback. Again, if you're interested, go on our website, Trauma Research Foundation, so we can help people, their brains to calm themselves down. And my other major project, actually, that's what I'm working on right now to write up the results, is the result of our psychedelic studies. I'm running psychedelic lab, and it is very interesting. The psychedelics, under very carefully controlled conditions, with a lot of therapy and a lot of attention to context, allow people to safely go to very difficult and dark places inside of themselves and to rearrange their reality. And so what we found is that psychedelics can be very helpful for people to resolve their trauma, to go back there and to really see what happened with compassion and with self-kindness. And people can really appreciate what they had to go through. And when they come out, they feel like it's over, that it's gone. And so the study of psychedelics is very central in my current life. And the other thing, of course, that I'm also still very devoted to is theater programs where traumatized kids learn to play roles, where they can embody strength, where they can embody different human emotions together with other people, and to have a sense of intimate, intense involvement with the other human beings through theater, action, movement, and music.
Professor, we thank you for your time. That's all the time we have, and I would like to present this diploma, which says that you are now the honorary member of the Association of Psychosomatics of Russia. And maybe we'll send it to you via DHL. I will personally come home to you and present this plaque. So thank you very much for being with us, and I'll see you again.
Thank you, Mike. Hope to meet you in person, not before too long. Okay. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.